Namo tassa, excuse me, Namo, sometimes I have, as I get the right rhythm, Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. That's the Sri Lankan way. It's not my special rhythm. Nam. Okay, never mind. Okay, so today we are taking sutta number 111 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called Anupada Sutta. And it was translated by, the title was translated very freely by Venerable Nyanamoli as one by one as they occurred. I don't know his reason for translating the title in that way. Okay, this is a sutta which I have to say I suspect is a later addition to the Sutta Pitaka. And there are certain reasons for that, for making that assessment. One is that there's no counterpart to the sutta in the Chinese agamas, which usually have translations of almost all the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya. And there's no other parallel to the sutta in any other collection of literature from the early Buddhist schools. And also the sutta uses some terminology which in Pali seems to be a little bit later from the period of the very early discourses. It seems that we're moving in this sutta towards somewhat more technical treatment of the teaching. In fact, I see this sutta to be almost a transitional teaching between the old stratum of the Sutta Pitaka and the style of analysis and elaboration that will become crystallized in the Abhidharma systems. And it's also significant that the sutta centers around praise of Venerable Sariputta and an explanation of Venerable Sariputta's path to enlightenment, the way in which he contemplated in order to reach the final realization of the teaching. And some of you may know that Sariputta is credited as being, in a sense, the father of the Abhidharma system, even though most schools ascribe the Abhidharma to the Buddha himself, but they consider Sariputta to be the one who sort of organized and elaborated the Abhidhamma. And we can see in this sutta some features of analysis that will become even more refined, more elaborate in the Abhidhamma. Okay, so turning to the text of the sutta, you can see that the sutta is actually ascribed to the Buddha himself, since it's said that it occurs when the Buddha was living in Savatthi at Jeta's Grove, and it's given as an address by the Buddha to the monks. And it begins with the Buddha praising Sariputta. And so maybe first we should explain, for some people who are fairly new to the Dhamma, who was Venerable Sariputta. Now, it's said that all of the Buddhas have two chief disciples. And so our Buddha, the Buddha Gautama or Shakyamuni Buddha, also had two chief disciples. And those two chief disciples were Sariputta and Moggallana. Moggallana specialized in what we would call miraculous powers, supernormal powers, psychic powers, the ability to multiply his body, to travel through space, to dive in water, to pass through walls, to make his body larger, smaller, and so on. And Sariputta's specialization was in wisdom, insight, or deep understanding of the Dhamma. Sariputta and Moggallana, even before they encountered the Buddha, they had been friends from boyhood. They had been very close friends. And then when they reached maturity, they both decided at just about the same time to go seek a path to enlightenment. They came from Brahmin families, but they became at an early age, disillusioned with their position of privilege, the easy life to which they had access. And they realized that as human beings, we all have to grow old, decrepit, die, and then take rebirth elsewhere. And so they thought, rather than just enjoy life, enjoy the wealth of our families, let us together seek a path to liberation. And so together they traveled all over India, seeking out different gurus or spiritual masters, until they came back to the state of Magadha, the city of Rajagaha, without really being satisfied with any teacher. Then they became pupils of one of the teachers who was living near Rajagaha, named Sanjaya. They weren't really satisfied with his teaching, but they just decided to accept him as their teacher. Then one day, when Sariputta was traveling around, he saw a monk who was walking very calmly, very peacefully on alms round. And this monk was one of the first 5 disciples of the Buddha, named Assaji. And so as soon as Sariputta saw him, he thought, that one knows. Because he could see from his manner, so calm, all of his movements, very mindful, very peaceful. He seemed to be fully aware of every step he was taking. So Sariputta followed him till he saw that this monk, after completing his alms round, went off to take his meal. Sariputta waited till he finished his meal. Then Sariputta came up to him and said, "Who are you? Who is your teacher? What is the teaching that you follow?" And then this monk, Assaji, said to Sariputta, he said, "My name is Assaji, and I'm a disciple of the prince of the Sakyan clan, who left the household life and became enlightened. And so now we call him the Buddha." And Sariputta said, "What is the Buddha's teaching? What is the essence?" And Assaji said, the monk Assaji said, "I'm just," even though he was a fully enlightened arhat himself, but he said, "I'm just a student of the master. I can't really explain it in great detail." But Sariputta said, "I don't need details. Just tell me the essence. Express it as clearly and concisely as you can." Then Assaji replied with just a verse of 4 lines. He said, "Whatever things there are that originate from a cause, the enlightened one has explained the cause, and he's also explained what is their cessation." That is the teaching of the great ascetic. And as soon as Sariputta heard this verse of 4 lines, there arose in him what is called the eye of Dhamma, the vision of the Dhamma. That is, his insight penetrated right through to the ultimate truth of the Buddha's teaching. And he became a stream enterer, that is, one on the first stage of enlightenment. Then, after reaching the first stage of enlightenment, he went to find his friend Moggallana and told him, "I found the path to liberation." And Moggallana said, "What is it? Tell me the essence." And Sariputta told him about this meeting with the monk Assaji, and then Sariputta repeated the same 4-line verse. And as soon as Moggallana heard the verse, boom, he also reached the first stage of enlightenment. And so then the 2 of them together, they knew that the Buddha was living in the bamboo grove, so the 2 of them came to see the Buddha at the bamboo grove. And as they were approaching, the Buddha was giving a discourse to the monks. And when the Buddha saw them coming in the distance, he told all of the monks, "Do you see that pair of young men who are coming here? Those will become my 2 chief disciples." And so the 2 young seekers came to the Buddha, bowed down to him, and asked to be admitted into the order of monks. And then the Buddha told them, "Come and live the spiritual life for the full liberation from suffering." And so in this way they were admitted into the order, into the Sangha. Then after their ordination, they received some further instruction from the Buddha. Then the 2 of them went off to practice in solitude. And Moggallana practiced very diligently for 1 week. And after 1 week, he achieved the final goal, arahantship. But Sariputta had to practice longer. He had to practice diligently for 2 weeks to reach the final goal. And so maybe the question comes, if Sariputta is the one who's foremost in wisdom, why did it take him 2 weeks to reach the final goal, where it only took Moggallana 1 week? Maybe to use an analogy, maybe it's like, okay, 2 boys go to college, and one of them is very clear about that he wants to go into business, and so he takes a quick course of maybe business management. He starts off, in the freshman year, taking economics, whatever he needs, statistics, mathematics, then goes into business courses. And so maybe 3-4 years, then he gets his bachelor's degree. But he has a very narrow focus. He just knows business administration. So he gets his degree. But the other student wants to become very widely learned. He doesn't want just a narrow specialization. So he has, a very wide range of interests. He wants to know everything about world history, philosophy, world literature. Maybe he wants to study several languages, French, German, Italian and Japanese, Chinese, and maybe dabble in a little sciences, some courses in physics, biology. So maybe it takes him 6 years to finish his bachelor's degree. But when he finishes, he'll have a much wider knowledge, and maybe on that basis he can go on for his master's degree and his PhD. And when he finishes his PhD with such a wide body of learning, he can get a job in McDonald's or Walmart, while his friend who gets the business degree becomes a millionaire at the age of 25. I'm only joking. Okay, but it's said that Sariputta, in order to become the one who's foremost in wisdom, had to explore and investigate a much wider range of phenomena and master many different areas of insight realization. Okay, so now this sutta is going to tell us the particular type of practice that Sariputta undertook in order to achieve arahantship. And so the Buddha begins the sutta with praise of Sariputta. So he starts by saying that Sariputta is wise. Actually, the Pali word is pandita, which is, if you know the Indian word pandit, which has become, it's acquired in modern English something of a derogatory connotation, like somebody who thinks he's very smart, or like the experts that you see on TV, the talking heads on the news programs. But originally in ancient India, the word pandita meant somebody who is very learned, erudite, and capable of making wise decisions. So Sariputta is wise. He's somebody who has great wisdom, mahapanyo. Somebody who has wide or vast wisdom, because he's comprehended a great number of subjects. Sariputta has joyous wisdom, like when he's developing insight, he's experiencing these insights with joy and delight. Sariputta has quick wisdom, java-panyo, speedy wisdom, rapid wisdom. That is, he comprehends very quickly. And Sariputta has keen wisdom or sharp wisdom, tika-panyo. That is, he understands things very precisely, very clearly, very lucidly. And then Sariputta has nibedika-panyo, penetrative wisdom, that whatever he investigates, he pierces it through, penetrates it with his insight, with his wisdom. It's like his wisdom, if you present him with any subject, any field for investigation, it's like maybe like a tangled mass of bamboos. But Sariputta uses his wisdom like a machete knife, just cutting right through that tangle of bamboos and cutting through and creating a clearing. So Sariputta is able to penetrate any subject that he's investigating. And then the Buddha says, during half a month, Sariputta gained insight into states one by one as they occurred. And when the Buddha is speaking about this half a month, he's referring to the 2 weeks in which Sariputta practiced insight in order to reach the stage of arahantship. And the phrase that Venerable Nyanamoli had rendered insight into states one by one as they occurred. I'll write the Pali for this expression on the board, and then I'll explain it directly off the Pali. Okay, the expression is Anupada Dhamma Vipassana. Of course, now Vipassana means insight. Dhamma means, in this case, it means phenomena, the factors of experience, the factors of bodily and mental experience. And anupada, this is a rather unusual term. Pada also means a state or a factor, and anu has a sense of according to. So literally it would be something like insight into dhammas, insight into phenomena, maybe according to the nature of the factors. I'm just sort of speculating or guessing the meaning of this term based on an analysis of each component of the expression. It's a term that I think occurs only in this sutta. And so it seems to be, one gets the impression that it's an experiment with a new term that just never caught on. But now the Buddha is going to explain how Sariputta's insight into states one by one as they occurred. So he's going to explain this insight into states one by one as they occurred. And so from the explanation, we can get some idea of what is meant by this expression. And the basic scheme will be that Sariputta entered into each of the higher meditative attainments, the 4 jhanas, then the formless attainments, then the 9th attainment, which is called the cessation of feeling and perception. And then he investigated each one in terms of its constituent factors. And so Sariputta's mode of practice combines the 2 elements of Buddhist meditation, that is, calmness or tranquility, samatha, and insight, vipassana. Or else we can call them combining the 2 components of samadhi, or concentration, and panya, or wisdom. And so those of you who have been studying Buddhism and practicing for some time, you know that there are 2 sort of wings of Buddhist meditation. So we call these serenity and insight. The practice of serenity involves choosing a single, usually very simple object, and then focusing the mind exclusively on that object until the mind settles upon that object and all other thoughts, distractions, the play of emotions subsides, and the mind can just settle into that object and become increasingly absorbed in it. As the mind becomes more and more absorbed in the object, then the various hindrances or mental obstructions subside. Usually the texts classify the obstructions to concentration in terms of the 5 hindrances. We have the hindrance of sensual desire, the hindrance of anger or ill will, the hindrance of dullness and drowsiness, the hindrance of restlessness and remorse, and then the hindrance of doubt. So the initial stage of practice along the road of serenity is to overcome the 5 hindrances, and this is done by keeping the mind focused upon a single, usually very simple object, like the in and out breathing, or sometimes a colored disc will be used, which they call the kasina object. So one just keeps the mind focused on that object until the play of wandering thoughts becomes, or distracted thoughts become stilled and subsides. But one is still using the factor of thought, which is called vitakka, applied thought, to keep the mind on the object. So if one is doing mindfulness of breathing, one is just aware, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. If one chooses, for example, the blue disc as the object of concentration, one will just be focusing on that disc, blue, blue, blue. Any other thoughts come to the mind, let them go, and just bring the mind back using that function of thought to direct the mind to the object, the in and out breath, the blue disc, or whatever other object one has chosen. Okay, so as one does this, over time the distracting thoughts subside, and then a particular type of mental image will appear representing the object, and one continues to focus on that image until at a certain point the mind becomes completely immersed in that object. And that first stage of a complete immersion in the object, where it seems that even the distinction between mind and object has sort of faded out, this is the first jhana, the first stage of meditative absorption. And now this stage is not particularly unique to the Buddha's teaching, but in any kind of meditation system, whether coming from other religions or even without any religious basis, where one just focuses upon a single simple object, it's possible for the mind to become so deeply absorbed, deeply focused upon that object, that the mind will move on to a different level of experience, from the level of our ordinary day-to-day sense-based experience to a level of experience where there's just no disturbance at all by any of the distracting thoughts, disturbing emotions. And so many practitioners from other systems take this state to be like a unification with the Absolute, or to be a state of unity with God, or the realization of the ultimate. But what the Buddha's teaching, what the Buddha teaches, is that this state of mental absorption is just a state of mind, a state of consciousness, which has been brought into being through effort, diligent practice. It's a state of mind that is constructed by volition. And if one examines that state of mind, one turns the mind back on that state and investigates it, one sees that it is constituted of a constellation, a multitude of distinct mental factors. And so this is what Sariputta did in his practice of the jhana. That is, he first attained through the practice of samatha, serenity meditation, concentration. Through that practice, he attained the first jhana, and then he turned the mind back on that jhana, sort of reflectively examining it. And that marked the beginning of vipassana, of insight, gaining insight into the nature of this experience. Okay, so the text tells us that Sariputta, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome mental states, entered upon and abided in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So this describes that state of jhana itself. And in that state of jhana, you could see we have 4 factors mentioned in this description. There is the applied thought, that is the vitakka, which directs the mind onto the object. There's something called sustained thought, which keeps the mind anchored on the object, or metaphorically rubbing the object, or which keeps the mind anchored on the object. And then that experience of jhana is very joyful, ecstatic. So it's said to have rapture, and it's accompanied by a very blissful feeling, very pleasant feeling, which is called sukha, pleasure, or perhaps even better would be bliss, rapture and bliss, born of seclusion. Okay, so that is a description of the jhanic state itself. But now the Buddha is going to go on to explain what Sariputta did when he attained the jhana. He says that the states in the first jhana I'm going to skip over the states now. We just jump down to these states were defined by him one by one as they occurred. And now, what are the states that Sariputta saw within the first jhana? And here we have a listing of the different mental factors that occurred within that experience. First, we have a listing of the 5 primary factors within the jhanic state. There is applied thought, that is the mental factor that has the function of directing the mind onto the object, or applying the mind to the object. And then we have vichara, translated here as sustained thought, but maybe I would use now examination. That is the factor that is looking at the object or examining the object. Then we have the rapture, because it's a very joyful or ecstatic experience, the pleasure or bliss, and the unification of mind, because the mind is just one-pointedly fixed upon that object. Then Sariputta examined in more detail, and he saw 5 factors present in that experience. First, there is contact, since within the jhana, what is taking place is a contact between mind and the object. And so it's a very subtle process or act by which the mind is touching the object. In fact, contact is present with every experience that we undergo. Like when I'm sitting out here looking at you, then my mind is making contact with this whole visual field of people sitting at seats with tables in front of them. So in order for seeing to take place, there has to be the contact between mind and the object. If I'm going to be, say I have a red kasina, so I'm not looking at multiple objects, but I'm just focusing the mind on a red circle. Even to the point where I become fully absorbed in that. But still, the mind is touching that red circle. So that mental touching is contact. Then there is a feeling. In this case, it's that blissful feeling or pleasant feeling. There is a perception. One is perceiving the object. If one is looking at, say, a classroom of other people, one is perceiving the classroom. At times, perception will have different focal points. So now I'll be focusing maybe Venerable Sagara Kantu, then I might look out in the back at Kaidi. Katie. I always get Kaidi mixed up. And maybe I look at in the front again, I see Johnny. Okay, so different perceptions, different people, but on any occasion there's some perception. And perception, feeling, contact, they all work together, but they're distinct factors. And then there is some volition or intention. So here on any occasion of experience, there's some volition, some intention. So now, when I'm speaking, every sentence that I say, that I speak, there has to be some intention to speak that sentence. Otherwise, if I let all intentions to speak drop away, but then I have the intention to sit quietly in my seat. But then everybody will get angry with me and complain that we came to this class and Bhante just sat in the seat quietly. So I have to stir up the intention to speak. Okay, but even in the jhanic state, in every jhanic state, from the first all the ways up to the last, there's some intention, some volition, the volition to be in that jhanic state. And then, of course, there is the citta, that is, mind or consciousness. And then there are some other mental factors that are present. So we have here mentioned, these English translations, not perfectly satisfactory. Zeal, or I would render this as chanda, desire, like desire to be in the jhanic state. This is not craving, it's not attachment, but it's just to do any action, one has to have some desire to perform that action. So even to be in the jhanic state, even the higher jhanic states, there has to be some desire to be in that state. So that is what's translated here as zeal. Some decision, adhimokkha, or resolution to be in that state. Then there is energy, which is empowering the state. There is mindfulness, because mindfulness plays an instrumental role through the whole process of meditative development. Then there is equanimity here, which is not the equanimity of neutral feeling, but this is the equanimity of mental balance, because the mind is held, in order to enter the jhana, the mind has to be held in a very balanced state, not too much. The energy shouldn't be tend towards excitation or excitement, nor should the energy be too loose, too slack, but there has to be a balance in the level of energy, a balance in the effort. And so that balance of all of the factors is what is here called equanimity. And then there is attention, that is the factor by which the mind is turned to the object. So if some of you have studied the Abhidhamma, you could see here how this passage is similar to the way in the Abhidhamma text we take every state of consciousness and then break it down into its constituent factors. Okay, so here what Sariputta has done is to take the jhana. It's a state of mental unification, but within that unification there is multiplicity, diversity. That is, many mental factors working together. And what is the purpose, the function of seeing the jhana as a multiplicity of factors like this? What is the benefit?
See it as a conditioned state, which is unsatisfactory.
Say again?
You see it as a conditioned state, which is unsatisfactory.
Okay, that's good. One sees it as a conditioned state. Any other aspect?
I think it
Okay, yeah, that's good. I think there are two things that you indicated there. One is that it makes one dispassionate towards the factors themselves, and also it helps to sort of dissolve what you might call identification with that experience as being a self. And so, one of the reasons that we grasp the idea of self, or the idea that there's a real I, a truly existing I, or in the Chinese, 我, or 善见, I think it's called, the view of a truly existing self, identity view, is because we don't see, we have this perception of ourself as being a unity, some kind of self-subsistent whole. But when we look at our experience with the eye of wisdom, then we see what is going on at any time that we're aware. Even in our day-to-day life, there's a whole bunch of different factors working together. There's feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness working together. Okay, so that we could see that in our ordinary experience, but also at these very elevated states of experience, the jhanic states, there's also a bundle of factors. And so when we see this experience as a bundle of factors which arise through various conditions and which just exist together through that experience, then it sort of breaks the self-identification with the experience. Okay, but now Sariputta continues further with his investigation. He sees these states, anupada vipassana, anupada dhamma vipassana, that is, he analyzes the experience into a bundle of mental factors, each with its own nature, and he defines them one by one. And then further, it said, known to him, those states arose, known they were present, known they disappeared. Maybe we should say, to use normal English word order, those states, he knew those states as they arose, he knew them as they were present, he knew them as they disappeared. And then he understood, so indeed, these dhammas, these states, these phenomena, not having been before, come into being, and having been, having come into being, they vanish. So what is being indicated here by this passage? Exactly. Where did it come from? You said it? Okay. So this is the insight into impermanence. It's also called sometimes the insight into arising and passing away. Sometimes udayabhaya. So before Sariputta entered the jhana, those factors of jhana were not present. He enters the jhana, all of those factors come into being. While he's present in the jhana, those factors continue. When he emerges from the jhana, those factors come to an end. So he's seeing now impermanence, arising, persisting for some time, passing away. And in fact, even within the jhana, what is actually taking place at a micro level is a succession of individual states of consciousness or individual frames of consciousness. It's just like maybe watching a movie. You know, when we watch the movie, we see the cowboy gets on his horse and goes riding into the sunset, and it looks like, you know, the same cowboy on the same horse riding into the same sunset. But if we get curious and we go back into the projector room, we take the film and unroll the film, and what was that cowboy movie we were watching? We see that it's really a succession of frames. You know, in one frame the cowboy is here, next frame he's here, next frame he's here, next frame the leg is lifting, next frame the leg is in the spur of the horse. And then we see a whole series of frames where the horse is going boop, 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 boop. But then when we put it onto the projector and get it rolling, then it looks like the same cowboy on the same horse riding into the same sunset. And so when looks with insight into the experience, even of the jhana, one sees it's a series of different acts of consciousness going very, very quickly. And so one gets the impression that it's just one continuous experience. But because Sariputta had very, very sharp wisdom, he was able to sort of put his mind into the divisions between the different citas making up the jhanic experience, and see how each one arises, stands, and passes away. And so he gets this insight. He understood thus: these states not having been, come into being; having been, they vanish. Then regarding these states, he abided unattracted or unattached by craving or attachment to them, and unrepelled by them, even though they were impermanent, but he didn't feel angry or upset by them. He dwelt independent, detached, free, dissociated, with a mind rid of barriers. And then he understood that there is an escape or a release beyond. In other words, he understood that even this first jhana, which is so joyful, so blissful, so relatively peaceful, is not the final stage. And so now he understands that there is some superior state beyond that. And then he continued his practice in order to achieve the state beyond that. At this point, I'll ask whether there's any questions. So this takes care of the first Sariputta's practice with regard to the first jhanic state. Okay, this gentleman in the middle, and then Katie. Use the microphone.
Could you please, yeah, repeat what you were saying about Udayavaya and Samudayavaya?
Yeah, these terms mean Udaya or Samudaya means arising, origination, and Vaya means vanishing, disappearance. So those are the two primary stages that mark impermanence, that what hasn't existed before comes into being, then it persists for a little while, then it vanishes. And so when one sees arising, vanishing, that becomes the insight into impermanence. Okay, this gentleman with a blue coat and
Is there an intention in this teaching to inspire the listener to enter into these states by knowing the factors involved, inspiring the listener to try to bring these factors to bear in their own consciousness in an effort to enter into the jhanic state? Is there that intention?
I say that of course that's definitely the case, but I think it also shows not simply to inspire one to enter into the state, but also how one contemplates that state with insight in order not to be sort of swept away by misinterpretations of that state. Wait, take the microphone. Johnny? First row. Here. Please, you can take the microphone.
Thank you. I don't know how to do this.
Do you know?
Bhante,
Yeah.
thank you for explaining the process whereby Sariputta entered into the jhanic state. I was wondering if you could add a little bit more regarding the focusing on the object, becoming immersed in the object, and then transitioning to the next stage where insight can occur. If you can please just expand a little bit.
More on focusing on the object?
Yes, how do you transition from focusing on the object to the point where further understanding can appear other than just looking at the object?
Okay.
I don't know if...
I think I get... So how does one make the transition from the stage of simple, let's call it simple one-pointed focusing on the object to the investigation with insight?
Right, how does one
Okay.
access more information?
Okay. Okay, here we get into a little bit of a controversial area. I'm not so sure whether we'll go into this. Okay, I'll explain according to the mainstream way of understanding. Now, within the jhana itself, one cannot actually investigate the factors individually. This has to be done by emerging from the jhana, so that the mind is not completely absorbed in the object, but one is still, we'd say, basking in the afterglow of the jhana. In other words, the mind is still very concentrated, but now it's able to use the factors of investigation, of examination more effectively. Because in the jhana, the mind is just completely absorbed on the object. The mind is completely focused on the object. And so one is undergoing the experience, but one is not able to investigate or distinguish its aspect. So one emerges from it, but with the mind still very calm, very settled, very wieldy, very wieldy, so that one could use the mind according to one's wish. And then one looks back at that experience and one investigates what was present in that experience. And generally what I find to be the easiest way to analyze all of these factors can be rather difficult, but the way that's more sort of approachable is to take it in terms of the 5 aggregates, to take it in terms of, let's put the physical form aside, but in that experience one has a feeling, one had a feeling. So one knows one had the feeling of pleasant feeling, the blissful feeling. One knows that one was perceiving something within that experience. And so one can clearly, comprehend the object of one's perception, the act of perception. And one had the experience of the volition that was present. And so in the experience, volition was present. And so when one turns back on it, one can see that volition was present. And then one knows